today we're going to complete our discussion of the difference between feelings and emotions. Chapter 1 of the book, All Feelings Are Good and Right, A Guide to Intelligent Living. And we'll begin by doing a review of what we went through the first part of this chapter, and then we'll go into part 2. So in part 1, we talked about feelings, primarily feelings and their function. And we can say the function of a feeling is to expand consciousness of self and situation. So out of that deeper understanding and clarity, we can have a more effective and right response taking place. Now, feelings are the interior private experience. We're going to talk about the main 4 points. Feelings are the interior private experience. Nobody knows what you're feeling, I'm feeling. We don't know what anybody else is feeling unless it's communicated in some way, through word or through action. And so it's the interior private experience. Okay. A second point about feelings is we don't choose our feelings. Feelings happen in us and they happen to us. Right? The third point helps explain point 2. The origin of a feeling is a thought or a series of thoughts, not necessarily in our full consciousness. And that was demonstrated last time with the example of Sally the snake and the 4 different individuals that came upon Sally. It coiled up, rattling, hissing, appearing menacing. Okay? Now, we don't choose our feelings, they happen in us and to us. And for the most part, we don't choose our thoughts either. The thoughts are automatic, and we did a demonstration of that last time. We'll just do a very brief demonstration now. So, all 3 of us are going to have the same word in our brain, and those of you who are watching this will have the same word in your brain as well, appearing in about 10 seconds. And it's a 5-letter word, and it's going to be there in 10 seconds. Try to block it, and you won't be able to. And then I'm going to ask you to say any other word other than the one that the brain automatically produces. So here we go. It's going to be there in about 10 seconds, so we'll wait a little bit. About 5 seconds. The color of the chair that I'm sitting in is, now don't say that word. I hope you tried to block it. So say anything other than that word.
Green.
Green.
Chair.
Chair. Oh, bananas never fly higher than airplanes. In other words, what I pointed out with that nonsense sentence is that we can choose what to do with what the brain produces automatically. So I didn't even have to stay with a single word like green or a different color. I could come up with something completely outside of the frame of reference of what the brain produces, which is why I went into some kind of absurd sentence like that.
Yeah.
Okay? So many of our thoughts are automatic, and just because the brain produces them doesn't mean that we have to go along with it. You know, we can work with it, expand on it if it has meaning or value. We can change it if we would like, alter it in some way, replace it. Okay? So the important point here is that we are the consciousness that is aware of the brain thinking, producing these thoughts automatically, largely based on their social conditioning. Okay. If you identify with yourself as the thinker, you're going to be less able to objectively pull back and observe what the brain is thinking out of its social conditioning, and in some aspects become a victim to the social conditioned brain, and come up with a bunch of ideas and beliefs that may not have validity or utility. Okay, so that's why it's important to recognize that our thoughts also can be, and for the large part, are socially conditioned and automatic. So any thoughts, comments on that piece there?
My only comment is, I think lot of our automatic thoughts too, we do have every day.
Every day, yes.
But consistent ones about ourselves or the way we view the world, and I think there's sometimes not an awareness of the persistence and consistency of our thoughts every day. And
Yes.
I think as those accumulate, I think we just take them more and more for granted, and more is just, this just is what is.
Yeah, that is the truth or the reality or what is.
Yeah.
Right, yeah, so you can see how important it is to be aware that the brain is thinking automatically. And for the most part, that's okay, but it's not always okay.
Yeah.
Automatic, as we discussed the first time, can be very useful and efficient. But when it's not, is when we have thoughts or ideas that are not true, that will produce a feeling, and unfortunately we'll use that feeling to affirm or confirm the validity of the thought,
Right.
right? And as we found out in the first part, the disturbing feelings that we have are signals that tell us that we're most likely attaching to a thought in the brain, a sentence or a story in the mind that's at odds with reality in some way. And in part one, we did present that as a hypothesis. There is a proof for that when we get into chapter 4 on time. Okay, so this is a very good point, that we don't want to just get caught up in these kind of conclusive thoughts that are repetitive or sustaining. And we get a little bit too comfortable with those thoughts, as if, you know, that's the way it should be or always will be. And that creates limitations. Okay, so one of the major concepts from part 1 around feelings is that no word, statement, event, situation, or person ever creates a feeling of us. Okay, what creates the feeling is the interpretation of those words, statements, events, situations, or what persons say or do. That creates the feeling. And it's our feelings that give us our experience in life. The world does not give us our experience in life. It's the thoughts, the interpretations, creating feelings that give us our experience of life. Without a feeling, it's not an experience, it's simply an event, or a situation, an occurrence. Okay, so feelings are what create experience, what we have as an experience as human beings. Okay? Anything I left out as a little summary about from chapter 1? The feeling is never the problem.
The check
Okay.
engine light, right?
Yeah, the feeling is not the problem. It's like the check engine light or the oil light coming on the dashboard of the car. The feeling is the signal that says, oh, go check what's going on in the brain. You know, just like when the oil light goes on, although it doesn't go on that much anymore in the modern cars, but back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the oil light would come on frequently. You just check the oil level, you go in and see that it's too low, and then you add the oil in and the oil light goes on, right? So the oil light would never be the problem. The problem's in the engine and the problem would be the oil level. So what you would do is adjust the oil level, right? And then the light would go out. Well, the analogy here is that the oil light is the feeling is the signal. The engine is the brain. The engine containing the oil, the brain containing the thoughts or ideas, right? And so you don't have to do anything to that oil light. You just adjust the oil level in the engine. You don't have to do anything to the feeling. In fact, we don't want to alter our feelings once you understand their function. What you alter is the thought, the idea, the story behind the feeling. And when you align that thought with reality and truth, using Byron Katie's terms, then the feeling subsides. It diminishes, subsides, gets replaced with a calmer, quieter, or maybe just neutral feeling. Okay, so the feelings are the signals that invite us to check our thinking to make sure that our thoughts are aligned with fact, truth, and reality. Okay? So feelings are part of the intelligence system of the brain, body, and I'll say the universe, that which birthed everything, who we are and everything that we rely on the planet Earth. Okay? So they're part of the intelligence system, and that's why we can say all feelings are good and right. The function of the feeling is to expand consciousness of ourself and our situation, so out of that deeper understanding and clarity, we can have a more effective and right response taking place. So how could that ever not be a good thing? That's why we say all feelings are good and right. But we can't say all emotions are good and right. That's very different. And in our society, in our everyday communication, and even within the profession of psychology and psychiatry, we will use the terms emotions and feelings as synonyms interchangeably. And what that does is it diminishes the utility of the feelings, and it creates a confusion. And this confusion, as we stated in part one, results oftentimes in considerable internal conflict, interpersonal conflict, and even international conflict. Okay? So anything more about feelings that we should look at before going on to emotions?
I think that's good.
Okay?
And you said, like, wouldn't want to change feelings if you could. It's interesting looking at our society and just how much effort has been put into trying to change feelings.
Right.
Via suppression, via, social media, substance abuse.
Distractions.
I think we've tried to do that, right?
Yes,
And it's
exactly.
kind of like you're saying, misunderstanding the system a little bit.
Yes. By not understanding that function of the feeling, then we try to change our feelings and manipulate our
Right.
feelings, which then is to miss the whole point of the feeling, of the disturbing type feeling.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right, so our society is largely based on pleasure-pain principles,
Right.
and disturbing feelings are seen as a problem that we want to get rid of.
Right.
But with this understanding, no, the disturbing feelings are actually the safeguard, they're the signal that say, hey,
Right.
take a look at your thoughts. Those thoughts are the problem, not the feeling.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's the main point being made here, so thank you for
Right.
emphasizing that. But you can go back into part one and get everything in detail and in sequence that would help you understand the summary that we're going through now, in case you missed part one. Okay, so emotions and feelings are not the same. Okay, the word emotion comes from the Latin word emovere, e meaning away from and movere meaning to move. So to emote is to move a feeling away from the interior private space to the exterior public. So that's the first difference between a feeling and an emotion. Feelings are the interior private, the emotion is the exterior public. The second difference is this: we can't choose what to emote, when to emote, how to emote. We don't choose our feelings. Feelings happen in us and to us. But we can choose how to emote and what to emote. The whole of the entertainment industry is based on this fact. The actor gets the script, they read the thoughts, the content, they get the feeling inside, and then they share that feeling through emoting. And the director might say, no, that's too intense, or no, that's not strong enough. And the actor can make it more intense or can bring it down. We can choose that. Another example would be, let's say you're in customer service and you're in the store and you're in the back and the shelf falls over and you've got everything strewn all over the place. And then somebody comes into the store in the front and you go out front and although inside you have that feeling of being very upset and angry that this whole thing happened. However, you're not going to show that to the customer. You're going to say to the customer, hello, welcome into the store. How are you? What can I do for you? And the customer says, well, how are you? I said, I'm perfectly fine. Thank you. Thanks for asking. Right? So I can have that feeling inside of all this upset about the shelf falling down and the extra hour of work I have and never emote that. I can choose to emote a peacefulness, a total okayness, equanimity, right? So that's another major difference between feelings and emotions, okay? The main difference between, well, not main, but a highly significant difference between feelings and emotions is in the function, okay? So, the function of a feeling is to expand consciousness. It's part of the intelligence system. The function of an emotion is very different. It's part of the communication system. Okay? The function of an emotion is to inform others of our experience in a way that invites understanding and wins a cooperation if cooperation is needed or wanted. So we can think of it as two different departments with two different funding sources. And you have the intelligence department and you have the communication department. Okay, a very important distinction. So we can say all feelings are good and right because how could it not be good or right to expand consciousness? But not all emotions are good and right. We can abuse the function of emotion. We can use emotions to manipulate people, to frighten, to hurt, or to harm people, right? Because it's now going out into the public. It's affecting others directly, right? And if you take a look at what's going on today in the world with a lot of intense polarization, a lot of that is coming out of the emotions that are being expressed by people, with the intensity of emotions, especially hostility, right? And so we want to be very careful and deliberate about the emotions, how we express them, and what is it expressed. Okay, so here we want to take a look at the distinction between a reaction and a response. A response occurs when I get a feeling. I take ownership of the feeling. No word, statement, event, situation, or person ever creates a feeling in us. So whatever he or she says or does that triggers a feeling in me is not a result of what they did, it's a result of how I'm interpreting what they did. It's kind of like a gumball machine. So you have a gumball machine with the clear glass bowl, and you have the blue, you've got the red, you've got the grape color, you've got the white gumball. Okay, so that's already existing in the gumball machine. So look, that's going to represent my feelings that are internal and contained. Okay, so the red we could say is anger, the blue we could say is equanimity, the white is calmness, pleasantness. Okay, so that's all contained within. So those are the feelings. Okay, somebody puts a quarter in the machine, turns the crank, and a gumball comes out. Now we have an emotion. What was internal in the gumball machine is now coming out into the world, and so that gumball now is no longer just a feeling, it's an emotion. Now, did the person create the white gumball? Did the person that put the quarter in and turned the crank create the black gumball or the blue? No, they activated something, okay? But what comes out was already there in its potential, just like when we did the example of Sally the snake and the four people. First person frightened, second person relieved, third person was friendly, the fourth person excited. Right? And again, if you don't know what I'm talking about, go back and listen to part 1. Okay? So yes, the person did something. They put a quarter in and turned the crank, and a feeling came out as an emotion. And we have a term for that one. It's a negative emotion coming out. It's having our buttons pushed. Well, in this example, we're having our crank turned. Okay? Right? So somebody can say or do something, but that doesn't create my feeling. That only activates the brain to produce an interpretation, which then produces the feeling. The more I'm dependent on somebody else, the more likely I'm going to react to what's being said. Reaction meaning this. An event occurs, somebody might say something, and then the brain interprets it automatically according to some pattern, as you pointed out before. Patterns can exist like this. I get the feeling, and then I blame them for what I'm feeling. That's a reaction. I go from triggering a situation to interpretation to feeling, and then sending that feeling immediately out. What's happening there is ignorance and an error in judgment, because I'm thinking that that person or that situation created this feeling which I don't like. But once I understand that a disturbing feeling is telling me that my interpretation is off and needs to be acknowledged and addressed before I communicate, when I take ownership there, then I can give a response. Okay? And I'm not just reacting. I'm not going, oh, you or that is creating this disturbance here. It's like, oh, I have an interpretation creating the disturbance, which tells me I need to come back and look at that interpretation before I communicate, before I use my emotion to inform the person of my experience in a way that invites understanding or wins cooperation. So let's say somebody insults me, right? So they say something like, oh, you're really stupid, you don't know what you're talking about. And then my brain interprets that as a threat to my self-image. I start to get nervous and scared inside that, oh, maybe I'm not as smart as I thought, or I'm not as liked by them as I wish I were. And so now I get scared, but I'm not going to show them my scared feelings, so then I cover that over with anger, an anger emotion. And we'll talk about anger in a little bit. And so then I say, how dare you say that to me? Right? So that's a reaction. Okay, I went right from the feeling to the emotion without taking ownership of the feeling. A response would go like this. Person insults me, says, you know, boy, you're really stupid, or you don't know what you're talking about. I start to get the hurt feeling, or a nervous, scared feeling. And then I immediately have this anger that wants to cover it over, and I go, wait, disturbing feeling. Where's that coming from? And then I think, okay, well, underneath that anger I can sense and feel the hurt. Well, where's my hurt coming from? Well, that's coming from my, I guess, giving importance to how this person thinks about me, and how that relates to how I think about myself and the security I can feel inside. And I said, okay, that's where that's coming from. Okay, so then do I want myself to be dependent on somebody else's view of me in order to feel okay about myself? I don't think so. So I take ownership for my own feelings and their function to expand my consciousness of myself and my situation. So now I'm not going to give a reaction of how dare you say that to me, but I might say something like, gee, you know, when you said that to me, I found myself feeling angry, and then I realized underneath my anger is a hurt feeling, and then I realized that I'm feeling hurt because I'm depending on you to have a good idea or feeling about me, and I don't like that, so now I'm just curious. What did I say or do to get you so upset with me? Right? It opens up understanding. A response opens up understanding, exploration, dialogue, rather than the reaction, which out of the ignorance around understanding the origin of this feeling, I start to blame and put it out there as if there's something or someone that's threatening me. Okay, so I just want to pause here for a moment. I know I'm saying a lot, I'm going on and on, but I don't want to lose people and I don't want to lose you. So, any thoughts or comments?
I have a comment. So, you know, many times you mentioned that, you know, rather than emoting, if you just edit your thought about a certain thing, you can shift your feelings. Or I guess shift the way you emote it, or just be recognizing the fact that this is how you're going to emote something. But how can, like, maybe you're not sure what your feelings mean to yourself, right? So maybe like movement through dance or yoga, like some sort of practice of emoting in that way keeps you from constantly reacting in a certain pattern. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like kind of, like, can we implement some somatic practices too in this like self-reflection and editing of like certain thoughts that induce these feelings?
Right, so
Yeah.
those would be tools
Mhm.
to reduce the likelihood of reaction,
Right.
Mm.
the pressure coming from inside to create change in something that we feel threatening.
Right.
So the practices that you're talking about here would allow us to feel more grounded, more centered, not so off-put where we would tend to react.
Right. Right. Because some people have these patterns so ingrained within them, like Josh was saying,
Right,
that it becomes this pattern in the body. Right. So.
right. Yeah, so those would be excellent tools,
Mhm.
practices to help
Right.
with that. When we come back to understanding the thoughts here as interpretations of what's happening, the thought, the feeling never be the problem, it's the thought of the story that's the problem. We would want to have a tool to work with understanding what is the story behind
Right.
and what kind of adjustments might be needed in that story.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And so one of the tools here is to use the editor function of the brain,
Right.
okay? And the metaphor here we'll use is, or the analogy here is that of the newspaper, okay? So a newspaper is meant to inform the community of what's going on so that people can choose whether or not to participate in whatever is taking place in the community. So the newspaper has different departments in it. Newspaper has the entertainment department, they have the financial department, they have the local news, national news, international news, retail items, and so on. And so the newspaper has that function, the purpose of informing the public about what's going on so that people could participate if they would like. Now, that function of the newspaper can be only really actualized if the information in the newspaper is accurate and meaningful. So we can say that each department has a story writer, but we want to make sure that the story writer is really unbiased, that the story writer is willing to put in the work to make sure that the information they're getting is accurate and ultimately it would need to be meaningful and relevant to the well-being of the community. So how do we ensure that the story writer is doing due diligence and getting accurate, meaningful information? Well, every newspaper has an editorial staff or an editorial department, or for simplicity, we'll just call it the editor. So the editor has the function of making sure that the story is accurate and that it contributes to the well-being of the community. There are three basic questions that the editor has. The first question is this true? Is what's in the story, the content of the story, true? Once it's verified that it's true, the second question of the editor is, are there other truths we need to keep in mind so we have an unbiased understanding of the whole of the situation? Because a lot of times, something could be stated that's true, but it's taken out of context, and then we get a false impression of what really took place. Very common example of that is a lot of the political ads. They'll take just one segment or one aspect of a politician's experience and then present it as if it's the whole thing, when it's not. It's taken out of context. So we want to make sure that we understand the whole of the situation. And the third question of the editor has to do with, does this contribute to the well-being of the community? If it does, if the content of it does, then we'll put it in print and publish it. If the content doesn't contribute to the well-being of the community, let's get another story that does. Okay? So the editor has those three questions. We all have that editor function in our own brain. So when a disturbing feeling happens, that's a time to call the editor to call your internal editor
Mm.
and find out what is the story, is it true, are there other truths we need to keep in mind, so we have an unbiased understanding of the whole of the story, and, by the way, does it contribute, the editor would say, does it contribute to the community as an individual, I'm gonna say, does it contribute to my well-being and the well-being of those around me to think this thought or to take this action, okay? So when we get that disturbing feeling, what is the story, and is what I'm thinking true? Are there other truths to keep in mind, so we have an unbiased understanding of the whole of the story? And does it contribute to my well-being and the well-being of those around me? Now, a lot of times when people have said this back to me, they've said, contribute to my well-being or the well-being of people around me. No, it's not an either or. Very little, if anything, in life is either or. Okay? It's my well-being and the well-being of those around me, because we are always living as a part of community.
Mm.
Okay? So when I'm feeling good and in balance, I'm likely contributing to the atmosphere around me positively. If I'm feeling distressed or disturbed, it's possible I'm contributing to the atmosphere around me in some kind of a tense or negative way. So I want to be
Mm.
really making sure that I have an internal sense of balance for myself and for those around me. So, story writer brings the story to the editor reads the story and says, okay, is this true? And the story writer says, yeah, Jim Belushi was there and he saw the accident and he told me all about it.
Mm.
Says, well, I'm not so sure, do you only have Jim Belushi? Yeah, I trust him. I said, well, I don't. See if there are others there that were at the accident, see what they say. So the writer goes out, interviews some more people, comes back and says, okay, yeah, Mary Smith was there and Bill Jones was there too, and they all have the same story. I said, okay, so now we'll take that to be true, that this is what happened, was observable. Are there other truths we need to keep in mind so we have an unbiased understanding of the whole of it? Well, here I want to give you a personal example, something that actually happened in 2008 during the John McCain and Barack Obama campaign. It was a Wednesday evening, I was sitting at home watching television, and this political ad comes on that says, do you know that Barack Obama was having lunch yesterday with Bill Ayers, an American terrorist who bombed federal buildings in the 70s? Is that the man we can trust to be President of the United States? Someone who's friends with an American terrorist? And then this door slams, and you get a little startled. Well, clever ad, right? They want a negative content associated with a nervous system reaction. Okay? So now, however, we bring in our three questions of the editor. The first question is, well, is it true that Barack Obama had lunch yesterday with Bill Ayers? Oh yeah, a lot of people saw it, were there. Is it true that Bill Ayers was an American terrorist bombing federal buildings in the 70s? Yeah, he was a member of Students of the Democratic Society, SDS, and part of the Vietnam War protest, and yes, they were bombing federal buildings as part of their protest. Well, there you go. Can I trust Barack Obama if he's hanging out with an American terrorist? Well, I guess we have another question to ask. So we have an unbiased understanding of the whole of the situation. So, who is Bill Ayers today? Well, Bill Ayers is a professor of sociology at the University of Chicago. All right, so what were they doing having lunch? Well, they were both members of the Southside Planning Commission for the city of Chicago. And there was a luncheon for the Southside Planning Commission with a total of 14 people attending the lunch. Oh, really? Well, that's a little different. Anything else? Oh, yes. There were both Republicans and Democrats at this luncheon. Okay, well, it's not feeling so terrible now. Anything else? Oh, sure. Yeah, the chairman of the committee who invited everybody, including Bill Ayers, is a Republican. And by the way, he's the chair of the John McCain campaign committee for the state of Illinois. So a few items left out.
Mm.
So we can see how important it is to understand the whole of the situation, to have an unbiased understanding of the whole of the situation, and not take things out of context. So another example, you're sitting in the waiting room, doctor's office, and the person next to you whispers, says, "See that person over there? They killed somebody last week." And you say, "Really? How do you know that?" The person next to them says, "Well, it was front page in the newspaper. You didn't see it?" "No, I didn't see it." So now, most likely, it's true. We have some corroborating evidence. So what feeling might you get?
Shock.
Shock?
Panic. Panic.
Panic?
Yeah.
Okay, shock and panic. Just hearing that you're sitting there with somebody who killed somebody else
Mhm.
creates a sense of unsafety. Shock, panic. So now we go to the second question of the editor. Are there other truths we need to keep in mind so we have an unbiased understanding of the whole of the situation? So for that, you simply ask, well, what happened?
Mhm.
And the other person says, well, there was a bank robbery last week, 13 hostages, and this fellow wrestled with the bank robber, grabbed the gun went off, and he killed him.
Mhm.
So now what's the feeling that she had?
And probably some more calmness.
Okay,
Yes,
going in
with,
the direction of
you know,
calm.
increased understanding,
Mhm.
another perspective,
Yeah.
kind of makes a little more sense.
Yeah.
So less kind of grotesque, if you will.
Right.
It tracks a little bit more in my head.
Yeah.
So maybe a little more relief in my body.
Yeah, so the body moves in the direction of being more relieved, calmer,
Mm.
or peaceful. And what happens to the panic?
It disappears.
The panic disappears, right?
Yeah.
So, you see, the feeling there came from the story in the mind.
Yeah.
It did not come from the actual situation or the facts of the situation. It's how the brain interprets it.
Mhm.
So that's really an important principle, that second question. Are there
Mhm.
other truths we need to keep in mind so we have an
Right.
unbiased understanding of the whole of the situation?
Right.
Okay. The third question comes up when the first two clarifications occur regarding what's true and the whole truth of things, but it's still hanging around. There's still a disturbing feeling hanging around. And we've done the work. And then we can ask this third question, which is, well, what's the thought hanging in there? So let's say that I was worried about not passing an exam. I went through the first questions and I realized what was contributing to that anxiety. Okay, right, I didn't read the book. I'm worried about it. I might fail. And then I say, okay, well, maybe I can study if there's enough time and I can,
Mm.
you know, increase my chances of passing. But then I'm still a little anxious.
Mhm.
I know what I'm gonna do. Then I can ask myself, does it contribute to my well-being and the well-being of those around me to continue to think that I may not pass this exam? And when I think about it, I realize, no, it doesn't contribute anything because I've already taken my plans.
Mhm.
Well, then what does contribute to my well-being? Well, to review my plans and see is what I'm planning realistic and attainable.
Right.
Mm.
Okay, so then I review and I say,
We're back.
so the third question in a situation like this is, does it contribute to my well-being and the well-being of those around me to continue to think that I might fail this exam? When I ask the question, I sit quietly and wait for an internal, deeper sense of the whole of the situation to emerge and see what answer comes. Either yes, it does contribute to my well-being and the well-being of those around me, or it doesn't. In this situation, I can't see how it contributes to anybody's well-being for me to continue to think negatively about this. So then I would ask this embedded fourth question, which is, well, then what does contribute to my well-being? And in this instance, it would be to take ownership and responsibility for my choices and for the outcome of my choices, and not try to escape my responsibility and the ownership for whatever is to come. So when I realize that, when I'm not afraid to take ownership of what's going to happen, then my anxiety is going to come down. So what does contribute to my well-being and the well-being of those around me? To take ownership for the consequences of the actions that I take. Okay? Sometimes this third question is standalone. I'll give a little funny example of that where it's a standalone question. One morning when I was walking out to my car, which was parked on the street, rather than on my driveway, which comes right off the street, I noticed that my car was right up against the driveway. There's a sign there that says no parking within 8 feet of driveway. In other words, to protect my access to my house from the street. So as I'm walking down the driveway, I'm fantasizing that I have a ticket on the car and I'm in the courtroom with the judge and the officer that gave me the ticket, and I'm complaining to them saying, that sign's there for my benefit, I can block my driveway if I want, and I'm getting all agitated as I'm fantasizing the story. And then automatically, I just sensed all the tension in my body and the anger, and I asked myself, does it contribute to my well-being and the well-being of anybody else on the planet for me to continue to think this fantasy? And my answer was no. And then the next embedded question was, well then what does contribute to my well-being and the well-being of those around me? And the simple answer was to pay attention to the fact that it's a beautiful morning, the sun is rising, the birds are chirping, the temperature is comfortable, nobody else is on the street, and boy is this peaceful. And my whole body just relaxed. So sometimes we just can use this third question with the embedded fourth question to bring a halt to these disturbing feelings that we get when there's no external trigger, but it's just coming from our own tendency to fantasize stories in our own brain. Now there's another point that I want to make about this, and I forgot what the point is. So I'm going to invite you, the audience, to give me just a few seconds to check inside myself and see what point I wanted to make here. Yes, now it came. All right. Now, I'm inviting you to see what I just did, which is to not be so concerned about, oh, what would people think if I just lost track of what's going on? Why? Because what contributes to my well-being and the well-being of those around me here is to take a pause, to take a moment to kind of reset what I was thinking inside so that I can come back and finish the communication. Okay? So keeping in mind the desired objective and letting go of the idea of the image that I might want to hold of myself or have anybody else hold of me. Okay? So here's the point. That fourth question, then what does contribute to my well-being and the well-being of those around me, is essential to ask, because if we don't create a positive in the empty space that's left when I say, nah, that doesn't contribute to my well-being or anybody else's around me, there's a tendency for the old thing to come back in. It's kind of like wanting to plant a new tree, digging the hole on a very windy day, leaving the dirt at the side of the hole and walking away for lunch without putting in the new tree first. What's going to happen? I'm going to come out and the dirt is just going to blow right back into the empty space, and I'm going to have to redig it. So whenever we ask the question about it contributing to our well-being and the well-being of those around us, and it's a no, we're not done. It's essential to put in the answer to the question, well then what does contribute to my well-being and the well-being of those around me? Because that answer is going to absorb and use the energy positively. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Right, so those are the three questions of the other two. We've already talked about emotions and their function and how they differ from feelings. Very important to understand the distinction between feelings and emotions. So now I'd like to give an example of that distinction And we'll do that by taking a look at anger. Anger as a feeling is always good and right. I don't care if it reaches the level of rage. Okay? We can be jealous, we can be envious, we can even be hateful. That feeling is always good and right. Why? Because its function is to expand my consciousness before I respond or communicate and deal with the situation. It's there to bring internal clarity and balance. So anger as a feeling is always good and right. But anger as an emotion may not be. Okay? And that's where we need to be judicious in terms of how we would use use anger as an emotion. So again, we don't want to frighten people with it unless it's really beneficial to frighten somebody in order to keep something bad or worse from happening. And I'm going to give an example of that shortly. Okay? So anger can range from being kind of miffed or irritated at the low end, ticked off. At the high end, it could be rage, even murderous rage at the extreme. Okay, so we're going to take a look at a couple examples here of a judicious use of anger as an emotion, because it does have its place. I know in a lot of the literature, and especially in the spiritual practices, the idea is that we shouldn't get angry or get beyond anger. And what I'm saying here is completely different from that. I would never tell anybody to not feel angry, just like I would never tell anybody to not be sad. Okay? Those feelings, interior feelings, have their proper place and function. I might, however, invite somebody to modulate or control the anger emotion. Right? So that's a wholly different situation there. So I'm going to say that the anger emotion does have its place, and it has a positive function as well. So I'm going to give a couple examples. I used to have an office in Chicago on Michigan Avenue, a very busy street, downtown Chicago. And I was in a high-rise building that had a wall that was an all cement wall, no windows. And so I was walking down the street along that wall, and I passed by 3 people, 2 women that had their backs against the wall, and a man who looked like he was a homeless man, didn't look like he belonged with them, standing very close to them, and everybody was quiet as I passed by. So I walked by maybe 5, 6 steps, and I thought, I can't just pass by here. I can't just let this go on. Whatever it is, I better find out what it is. So I turned around and I walked back, and I said in a very firm voice, "Ladies, is everything okay here?" And the fellow took off. Now, if I had walked up with this kind of gentle, kind, "Gee, is everything okay?" He'd probably say, "Yes, mind your own business, everything's fine." Because he wouldn't have gotten the signal coming from a firm tone, which is a low level of anger, that if it isn't okay, there could be a problem happening between him and I. It could escalate into something that he didn't want it to escalate into. So by using a firm tone, it signaled to the person that this could be a serious situation, so we have to work with it seriously and come to some kind of understanding and resolution. Well, his was to take off and not be bothered with having conflict. And the women thanked me profusely for coming back and intervening here. So that's a low level of expression of anger. Now I'm going to give an expression of rage, and how that rage was likely preventing something terrible from happening. So there was a fellow in the neighborhood that had a German Shepherd dog that was very well trained. He would always sit at the corner and wait for his owner to say, "Okay, it's okay to go." But the problem was that his dog would attack the other dogs in the neighborhood when he would, just come across another dog, and he was off leash, and so he'd be running and attacking. And one night I had 2 Afghans and on a leash, and his dog came attacking, and I'm holding them up and keeping them from going wild with his dog, and Unfortunately, his dog got bit and was bleeding, and the fellow came across, said, "Oh, I'm so sorry this happened." And I said, "Well, I've heard from other neighbors, as well as myself now, that your dog often attacks them. And they've mentioned to you, and I have before, that it's really necessary to have your dog on the leash when you're taking him for walks." He says, "Yeah, yes, I know, you're right. Okay. So this is after months of it happening. A couple weeks go by. I'm watching Grizzly Adams, the mountain man, on television. And in this story, a grizzly comes attacking Grizzly Adams, and the grizzly's coming up to him like this, coming at him with the claws. And Grizzly Adams runs at the bear going, "Arrgh!" And the bear took off. Well, with a grizzly bear, you would never want to do that, because it'll probably kill you. You can't scare or fight off a grizzly bear. The best thing you can do is get on the ground, cover your head and neck, and hope for the best. Play dead. You can't do that with a black bear, however, because black bears will get frightened and they will run off. So I was watching this program, and then after that, at night, 10 o'clock, dark out, walking my two dogs, and I see him coming with his dog. And I'm wondering, is his dog on the leash? And I couldn't tell. And all of a sudden, his dog comes charging at us across the street, like he had done before, and I did what Grizzly Adams did. I went, "Arrgh!" And his dog ran back to the owner. Now the owner comes charging over at me saying, very angrily and loudly, "How dare you scare my dog?" And I went, "You're yelling at me!" He goes, "Oh, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that. He should be on the leash." Now, I don't know if any of you would want to attack somebody who's going, "You're yelling at me!" Most likely not, because you think this person might be nuts and it could be a big problem. The point I'm making here is that by expressing rage as a response, not as a reaction. Now remember, we already talked about reaction and response. If that was a reaction, there's a greater possibility that there could have been a negative consequence. It was a response, meaning that I knew that we had spent 6 months talking to this man, and no matter how much we talked about it, no matter how many of us talked with him about it, it didn't change his behavior. He was coming at me aggressively, and my judgment at the time is if I show him an aggression much bigger than his, frightening him, he's going to back down because of his fear. It's a little gamble, but not much of a gamble, because believe me, I wouldn't want to mess with anybody that was that enraged. And it worked. That was the last time his dog was off the leash, and we no longer had the problem. So the point I'm making is that anger does have its rightful place, but we need to be judicious about it and make sure that if we do express anger, it's coming as a response, meaning there's a rational judgment and assessment behind it that says this is likely to make the situation better than it would be otherwise. Anger as a reaction, however, comes out of conflict and is likely to continue to produce conflict. So, finally, I would like to give another example of the use of response versus reaction, and we'll use another example of anger. So you have two sisters, Mary and Jane. Mary's a senior in high school, Jane's a freshman in high school. Mary's in her room studying very hard for an exam the next day. And then all of a sudden from Jane's room comes this blaring acid rock music to the point where Mary can't even hear her own thoughts. So she can't concentrate anymore and study. Immediately she has this anger inside, this roiling anger with the thoughts, Jane doesn't care about me at all, she only cares about herself, she wouldn't care if I failed my exam or not. That little so-and-so, I can't put up with this. And she goes racing across the hallway, busts into Jane's room and says, "Turn that thing down, I can't even hear myself think, what's wrong with you? just get out of here so I can study. And then what's Jane's reaction or response? Well, chances are it's going to be a reaction, so they might start arguing or screaming, and parents have to come upstairs and put a stop to it. Or maybe Jane starts whimpering and she's scared and shuts everything down and is crying in the corner. Okay. That happens, and Mary might be coming a couple hours later being apologetic for losing it and making her feel bad. Or maybe Jane really is a nasty little girl, and Mary's going to find a grape juice stain on her favorite white blouse in the closet the next morning. In other words, something not very good might happen in a situation like that. So let's do take two. Jane has taken this course, understands the difference between feelings and emotions and their functions. So take two. Studying, concentrating, acid rock music coming out of Jane's room, gets enraged, very angry, thinking she doesn't care about me, wouldn't mind if I failed my test and so on. And then Mary goes, okay, disturbing feeling of anger, where's my editor, gotta call my editor. Is it true that she doesn't care about me? Well, oftentimes. Well, is it true that she doesn't care about me in this situation? No, I don't know, I don't have any evidence for that. Okay, are there other truths to keep in mind, so I have an unbiased understanding of the whole of the situation? Yeah, the other truth is I really don't know what's going on with Jane. Okay, and what else is true? Well, what I really want is just to have quiet to study. And one option is to have Jane turn it down, another option is to go somewhere else where I have the quiet, so I guess I could do that. Oh yeah. Third question, does it contribute to my well-being and the well-being of those around me to go in there blasting Jane? Probably not. Well, then what does? The embedded fourth question. To use the emotion to inform Jane of my experience in a way that invites her understanding and wins her cooperation. That's the function of an emotion, right? So I'm using the function properly. So now, Jane walks across the hall with her heart beating with an internal anger. Not a problem. The feeling is internal and private. She still has the fantasy about her sister not caring about her and interrupting her study and not being able to succeed. So she has that internal feeling operating, but she has control over the emotion. And so now she knocks on the door. There's no answer because Jane can't hear it. The music is so loud. Opens the door gently and quietly and says, Jane, Jane. Jane goes, what, Mary? Jane says, I'm studying for an exam. Your music is so loud I can't even hear myself think. Would you mind turning it down? And Jane says, sorry, Mary, I didn't even know you were home. Sure, I'll put my headphones on. What a difference. What a huge difference. To allow yourself, in this case Mary, to have her feelings, to not judge herself. I shouldn't be angry. Oh, no, I'm angry. What does the anger neither want? Okay? Anger typically is a protest that says, I don't like the way things are. I want things to change, to be different and better. So anger as a feeling is always looking for positive change. The trick here is to know whether or not you need anger as an emotion to move in the direction of that positive change. And I would say most of the time, the vast majority of the time, we don't need anger as an emotion. What we need to do is distill the meaning behind the anger feeling, know what the desired objective or outcome is, and to be able to impart that with an emotion that informs and invites. Okay? There is another type of anger that we call lit anger, and I expressed that earlier. That's when we have a deeper feeling that we're uncomfortable with and we cover it over with anger. It would be like the lid on a cup. And if you go to see what's inside the cup, all you see is the lid being the anger, and what's down inside the cup, a deeper feeling like hurt, scared, sad. Okay. But once we understand the positive function of the feeling, we don't have to be afraid of the hurt, scared, or sad. And we don't need lit anger to happen at all. Okay? Because then we know how to deal with those feelings down below, how to work with the meaning behind those feelings. So, I hope that the example of Mary and Jane gives you an experience of one way of using these questions of the editor, helps point out the distinction between the feeling and the emotion and their function, and kind of presents the opportunity to recognize how important it is to make this distinction between feelings and emotions and their functions. So imagine what the world would be like if everybody understood this, if everybody took ownership for their own feelings and were able to work through the feelings so that they could give responses to whatever the situation is rather than reactions. A whole lot of judgment about ourselves and others would diminish significantly. A whole lot of blaming of ourselves and others would also diminish significantly. And I think the world would be a more harmonious, peaceful place to be living in. Next time, we are going to take a look at what we call process and conclusive thinking. And process thinking is behind all blame. So we will be taking a look at blame versus understanding. Thank you for listening.